Greetings, history seekers. Welcome back. Today, we witness the most terrifying test of faith ever. On a desolate peak, an old man raises a heavy blade. He prepares to offer his only child to God. How did it come to this nightmare? Why would the Almighty demand a ruthless price from his loyal servant? For Abraham, this was no simple test. It was the shattering of a promise and his absolute legacy. Let us retrace those 3 terribly silent days. Witness the crushing burden of absolute devotion. For decades, Abraham wandered the harsh deserts of ancient Canaan, holding on to a divine covenant. The Almighty had promised him a great nation, yet his wife Sarah remained barren into her old age. According to ancient biblical texts, a miracle finally occurred when all mortal hope was lost. In his twilight years, Abraham was blessed with a son. They named him Isaac, meaning he will laugh with joy. Isaac was not merely a child. He was the living embodiment of God's sacred promise to his lineage. The patriarch watched his son grow strong amidst the quiet nomadic tents. His lifelong struggles were rewarded. Abraham had wealth, respect, and the ultimate comfort of a male heir to carry on his holy mission. For a fleeting moment in time, the desert winds carried only peace. The old man's heart was finally at rest. He had surrendered everything to follow his God. Now, he sat at the absolute pinnacle of human joy. But biblical history rarely allows its greatest figures to remain in the comfort of quiet safety. True faith, scholars note, is forged not in times of peace, but within the crushing fires of tremendous human loss. The peaceful camp slumbered under a blanket of stars. No one could foresee the approaching, devastating storm. Abraham slept soundly, entirely unaware that his devotion was about to be pushed to its limits. The ancient world was brutal. Surrounding pagan tribes routinely offered human blood to their savage idols. However, the God of Abraham had always been different. He was a deity of profound life, not cruel death, or so the aging patriarch deeply believed. His theology rested entirely on this foundation. Isaac walked through the camp, his youthful energy a stark contrast to the weathered faces of the elders. Every glance Abraham cast upon his son was filled with immense pride and overwhelming paternal love. This was his miracle child, the living proof that the unseen Creator kept his promises to mortals. But the divine silence was suddenly broken. A terrifying command echoed from the heavens above. Take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love. Go to the region of Moriah and sacrifice him there. The words struck like a physical blow. The very foundation of Abraham's reality collapsed. He was ordered to destroy his own flesh and blood. He was asked to burn the future of his lineage. Early the next morning, Abraham saddled his donkey. He cut the wood for the offering in silence. He took Isaac and 2 servants. The agonizing 3-day journey into the desolate mountains began. Historians emphasize the grueling nature of this trek. The rugged terrain mirrored his internal suffering. For 72 hours, Abraham walked beside his living son, knowing he led him to a tragic fate. He could not share his crushing burden with anyone. The profound isolation was absolute torture. Isaac remained completely unaware of his dark fate. He followed his respected father without fear. Each step toward Mount Moriah was a deliberate act of supreme willpower, overriding instinct. The sun beat down mercilessly on the travelers. The barren landscape offered no comfort to the father. At night, by the flickering campfire, Abraham watched his son sleep. The agony in his chest was unbearable. Why would the Creator demand a human life? Was this a cruel paradox or ultimate submission? If you were forced to choose between your highest moral duty and the life of your child, what would you truly do? On the third day, Abraham looked up and saw the dreadful place in the distance. The moment of truth arrived. He instructed his servants to stay behind with the donkey. He and the boy would go further up to worship God. Abraham took the heavy wood for the sacred offering and placed it on the shoulders of his beloved son. In his trembling hands, the old patriarch carried the burning coals for the fire and the bronze, sacred iron knife. They walked together in heavy silence. The only sound was the crunch of dry stones beneath their leather sandals. Then Isaac spoke, piercing his father's heart. "Father, we have the fire and the wood now, but where is the chosen lamb?" It was the most devastating question a son could ask. Abraham's soul wept, but his voice remained perfectly calm. "God himself will provide the lamb for the offering, my son." The tragic irony of those words hung so heavily. Some theological scholars argue that Isaac, a strong young man, must have begun to suspect the grim truth. Yet there is no record of rebellion. The steep climb continued as morning mist faded into harsh light. The jagged rocks of Moriah offered no escape. They were entirely isolated from the living world. Every breath of thin mountain air felt just like a dagger. Abraham's physical strength waned, but his resolve held firm. He was trapped in a divine paradox. To prove his faith as a righteous man, he faced an unspeakable act. Was this a test of loyalty, or a brutal demonstration of absolute divine power over human life? They finally reached the designated peak. The wind howled across the empty summit, amplifying tension. There was no turning back now. Abraham began to gather large, rough stones to construct the sacred stone altar. His ancient hands moved methodically. Each heavy stone he placed felt like another nail into his coffin. He arranged the dry branches carefully upon the stone structure. The terrible stage was completely set for the end. Then came the moment of horrific revelation. Abraham turned to his beloved son with trembling, tearful eyes. "There is no hidden lamb, my boy. You are the offering demanded by the Almighty Creator of the heavens." The heavy silence that followed must have been deafening. Isaac stood before the altar, processing his grim doom. He was strong enough to overpower his frail father and flee. Yet ancient texts mention no struggle whatsoever. Isaac willingly surrendered to the horrifying decree. He let his weeping father bind his wrists and his ankles. The rough ropes bit deeply into the young man's flesh. Abraham lifted his bound son onto the harsh wooden pyre. The boy lay completely still, staring up at the dark sky. The ultimate sacrifice was securely in place. Abraham stood over the altar, his heart shattering to pieces. He reached out and grasped the cold, solid bronze handle. He slowly raised the heavy, sacred iron blade high into the air. The sunlight gleamed sharply off the deadly edge. This is the exact fraction of a second where humanity holds its breath. The point of no absolute return. Pause and consider this haunting image. Could you destroy your own flesh and blood because a voice commanded it? His parental instinct screamed at him to drop the weapon, but his strict obedience overpowered his nature. He braced himself to deliver the final tragic blow. He closed his eyes, preparing for his son's final moments. But before the blade could descend, a thunderous voice tore through the heavens, stopping time itself on the mountain. "Abraham! Abraham!" The urgent cry of the divine messenger shattered the unbearable tension around them. "Here I am," the old man gasped, his voice breaking with absolute terror and overwhelming exhaustion. "Do not lay a hand on the boy," the angel strongly commanded. "Do not do anything to harm his innocent life. Now I know that you truly fear the Almighty, because you have not withheld your only son from my decree." The heavy bronze knife slipped from Abraham's trembling fingers. It clattered harmlessly against the rough stone altar base. He collapsed to his knees, weeping uncontrollably. The crushing, heavy burden was instantly lifted away. He looked up and saw a wild ram caught by its horns in a dense thicket of sharp, thorny bushes nearby. The Creator had indeed provided the substitute offering. The boy's life was spared at the very last second. Abraham rushed to untie the thick binding ropes. He pulled Isaac into a desperate, protective embrace. He then took the entangled ram and offered it as a sacred offering instead of his beloved child. He named that holy place Yahweh Yireh, which translates to, "The Lord will actively provide for his people." This deeply profound narrative from the book of Genesis remains one of the most debated texts in history. Was it merely an ancient polemic designed to strictly condemn the pagan practice of human sacrifice? Or was it a brutal psychological masterpiece illustrating the need of unquestioning faith? Regardless of interpretation, Abraham descended the mountain as a truly transformed patriarch. He had stared deep into the dark abyss of total loss and emerged as the supreme father of monotheism. His agonizing willingness to surrender his most precious possession secured his eternal legacy. The divine promise was reaffirmed with even greater power. His descendants would outnumber the desert sands. Yet one must deeply wonder about the lasting psychological scars inflicted upon young Isaac. How does a son ever look at his father the same way after being bound to a sacred stone altar? The scriptures remain silent on their journey home, but the heavy shadow of Mount Moriah would linger forever. This single terrifying event shaped the core theology of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. It stands as a monumental testament to the terrifying weight and severe demands of devotion. Abraham proved that his faith was not merely words. It was an uncompromising action, paid in pure agony. The physical flames were never lit, but his human desires were entirely consumed on that lonely peak. Now his lineage was secure. But the dramatic history of his descendants was just beginning now. From the seeds of this traumatic test, a massive nation would slowly rise from the dust of the dry desert. But human nature is flawed. The toxic cycles of intense family jealousy would soon repeat again. How did a young boy, sold into brutal slavery by his brothers, end up ruling the ancient Egyptian world? The journey down the mountain was undoubtedly quieter than the terrifying ascent to the peak. Abraham walked slowly beside his living son, carrying the profound, heavy weight of a divine prayer. They returned their waiting servants, forever changed by the invisible fire of absolute, deep faith. Isaac was no longer just a beloved boy. He was a survivor of the ultimate spiritual test. The camp welcomed them back, entirely unaware of the dramatic cosmic shift that had just occurred. Years would quickly pass. The great patriarch Abraham eventually closed his eyes in a peaceful rest. He left behind a magnificent legacy. His descendants began to multiply across all the lands. The sacred divine covenant survived, passed down to Isaac and his many children in the harsh desert plains. But peace is always fragile in human history. The toxic shadows of family envy soon returned. A new generation arose, carrying the heavy burden of destiny and bitter jealousy. Isaac's grandson, Joseph, would soon face his own terrifying trial at the hands of his bitter brothers. Betrayed and sold into foreign slavery, a young boy was forcibly ripped away from his father's love. How could a forgotten prisoner in a dark Egyptian dungeon ever rise to command an empire? What incredible strategy allowed a foreign slave to hold the absolute survival of the ancient world? The saga of survival and ultimate power continues. Join us next for episode 6 of this grand journey. Before we conclude this chapter, we must confront the moral earthquake left by Abraham on the mountain. It forces every modern reader to seriously examine the foundation of their belief systems. The story of Abraham leaves us a haunting question. Was his willingness to harm his son ultimate devotion, or does it reflect the terrifying danger of blind obedience? Tell us your deep thoughts down in the comments. If you enjoyed this historical journey, please like, share, and subscribe for more epic ancient stories.